My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
Now get all fired up, because tonight there's going to be a jailbreak. We're busting out of the fungoid gardens. Never a dull moment as we return to Carcosa.
Our first segment is the Basic Crawl.
Carcosa is a setting book written by Geoffrey McKinney and featuring art by Rich Longmore. It was originally published in a smaller pamphlet form in 2008, but was picked up by Lamentations of the Flame Princess and published in an expanded second edition in 2011. And in this episode, we'll be covering the second half of the expanded edition from page 112 to page 237. And if you're interested in the tables that follow that at the back of the book, refer to our Part 1 episode, where we talked about that stuff. What we're talking about today begins with the Carcosa campaign map hex descriptions. Each of the 400 hexes on that map, which covers only part of the planet, is given 2 points of interest, such as a location, settlement, monster, or interesting and unusual personage with which to interact. Fungoid Gardens of the Bone Sorcerer is a sample adventure following that, detailing one of the campaign map hexes and providing a dungeon to be explored, where the eponymous Bone Sorcerer tends a subterranean fungus forest for alchemical purposes with the aid of a robot gardener and assorted minions. After the room descriptions, there is a map of the dungeon, 20 pre-rolled spawn of Shub-Niggurath, which may be encountered within the dungeon. And then, just as a final thing, before the random tables we covered last time, and I guess technically part of that appendix bit, is a short 2-page treatise on humanity on Carcosa, which is actually quite important despite its short length. It describes Carcosan civilization, such as it is, and notes 2 slim hopes for those heroes who might seek a better future for humanity on this planet. And I quote, "A small minority of sorcerers is lawful, and do not prey on men, instead using their sorcerous knowledge solely to banish forces inimical to mankind." And secondly, and again quoting, "By fortunate and improbable coincidence, the technology of the space aliens is, relatively speaking, easily used by men." Okay, so let's talk about how we've used this in our games. In my case, that is almost not at all, except as off-screen references when characters were communing with outer spirits, demons and the like, who would drop in the occasional reference to Carcosan sorcery. How about you, Jason?
So I mentioned during part 1 that I have frequently used all of the material in the Carcosa book in different ways, principally to sort of build out adventures or to just, or using it as a toolbox or a grab bag of like elements to put into even non-Carcosa campaigns, actually. But I actually, since then, have completed a mini campaign hex crawl, using the hex crawl portion as a hex crawl. So yeah, I have done the thing. So let's talk about things we liked about this portion of the book, which is principally the big hex crawl portion. I'd like to kick off by saying that this part of the book is a lot. It is a huge amount of hexes, each with 2 entries. I have never read all of them until preparing for this episode. It's the first time I've ever done it, despite the fact I've used this book a lot. And I don't think I recommend it. I don't recommend anybody using this book to just read all of them straight through. If you intend to use it as a grab bag like I traditionally have, you can just skim it. If you intend to run it as a hex crawl, just worry about the hex locations as you enter them. So that little bit I want to just kind of put out there. Mm-hmm. Getting back to our format, though, and saying what we liked about it, I will say that I like how, in Carcosa, everything is just kind of, it seems like it's very uncaring, right? Like, it's just there. All of this stuff is just there. There are communities of people doing their thing. There are monsters kind of going about their business. There are ancient piles of ruins or space alien, ship crashes or whatever that may have something interesting or may not. It's all just kind of exists. And I find that super fascinating. There isn't a huge amount of effort to connect all these things up. Although many of the hexes are connected to each other, it still generally just kind of feels like, here is this world and it is objective and uncaring. And I think that there's something very interesting about that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, one of the things I like is the fact that a lot of the contents are interesting whether or not you bother with them. Okay, so there are a lot of places where you can encounter a group of people, or you'll find some ruins, and there may or may not be. Quite often there's a quite detailed encounter you could have, but they tend to be formatted in a way so that even if you just kind of watch this posse of strange riders pass by on a high ridge and stay away from them, it would still be something interesting to talk about later. Like, hey, you remember those guys we saw about 5 miles back? Like, it's interesting just to experience them, even if you don't like choose to join them in their quest or fight them or trade with them or whatever, or explore the ruins or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, one of the members of the Gauntlet community who goes by the internet name Horst, he once told me that the sort of way he likes to run OSR adventures, and he's much more steeped into OSR as a design sort of movement than I am. He said that he likes the fact that the story is just kind of whatever we did, right? And that always rang a little hollow for me until I did the hex crawl. Before that, it was this notion of like, well, the story is just whatever we did. Like, that's the story. The story is whatever we talked about as players afterwards. That's the story. And me coming from this role-playing game tradition of the sort of writer's room approach, where like as a whole table, we're very actively participating in twisting and shaping things to fit into a good narrative, right? Like, simulationist concerns be damned. That always just like felt a little jarring, like this idea of like, well, if the world could just be uncaring and the story is just whatever happened. But having done the hex crawl, I see it. I still don't think it's my favorite way of role playing, but I definitely see it. And I think that kind of dovetails with what you were saying there. Like, there's this sense of just like, there's a sort of like experiential quality to it. And sometimes your characters, put the pieces together. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they remember things from before. Sometimes they don't. And that's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah. It makes me think of, oddly, a non-fiction book I read ages ago. It's very good. I recommend it if you're interested, by Peter Hopkirk, called Setting the East Ablaze. And it's about communist agents, trying to spread the revolution in the 1920s in Central Asia. And one of the little episodes in that is a bit where they're around Kashgar or somewhere on the Silk Road. And a guy appears in the narrative. I mean, the author even mentions he just sort of appears in the narrative. And it's this man who's traveling with some elephants, which are like for a circus or something. And he's encountered in a couple of different places by these different spies for Britain and the Soviet Union. And then he just kind of disappears and history never sees him again, him and his elephants. Like, they're just somewhere out there on the steppe. Although for all that we're saying it's kind of uncaring and random, there are instances where things give you hooks to something else. So to give an example, in the more detailed section around the Bone Sorcerer's Gardens, when we dive into the Hex, there's a group of dinosaur riders you can meet, and they have a like kind of Wild West style, we want to go and raid this evil village. And so you might join them on their, help them to raid a village, or maybe you're on the side of the villagers for some reason. But even if you don't get involved in that, they do have useful information, because they'll tell you about the dungeon over there, and they'll give you these little story hooks. So even though they're not kind of expected things for you to deal with, they do still serve a narrative purpose in moving you on to the next thing that may be interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good segue into the other thing I liked about this portion of the book. And that is, many of the hexes do link up, or they do make reference to each other. So, for example, if there's a monster or a location that's particularly important to a sorcerer's ritual, which is the stuff we covered last episode for Carcosa, that's noted in a sidebar next to each hex entry. So there's a sidebar that has the name of the ritual that is implicated here, or it has the hex number of an associated hex. And I know you'll like this, Tom. The PDF is internally bookmarked, so you can just jump straight to that stuff. Yeah. Is there anything else you liked about the book?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I want to say just sort of extrinsically to its value, as even like a game text or whatever. You mentioned the size of it. I think we have to salute the sheer dedication of sitting down and doing 800 points of interest.
We really do. I know.
For hexes. Because I once did a kind of quick start setting with pre-generated characters for another game, my own game, which had 12 PCs you could pick from in it. So I had to make a little grid, essentially, how they all felt about each other, 12 by 12. And that became grueling and frustrating about halfway through. So Lord alone knows what doing 800 was like. It really is a feat of kind of creative endurance, I would say.
Awesome. When they said expanded edition, they really meant it. Awesome. Well, let's talk about questions we had. So I have a couple. What would you do, Tom, for the hex locations that imply something much bigger and more detailed? For example, one of the hexes talks about a huge crystalline space alien complex, almost like a city. There's another one that has like a pyramid, inside of which is supposed to be a tunnel that goes to the center of the planet. Suppose the party wants to explore those things. How would you handle it?
That's a great question. I would say it depends. It will depend a little bit on the specifics of that. So like, I think for a large crystalline structure, that's something I could probably improv with my sort of weird, like just imagery in the back of my head. Maybe a labyrinth move or two. I would be okay with that cropping up kind of in the middle of a session. I think I could handle it, unless for some reason it looked like a huge long encampment was going to happen there. But for something like where you're really changing the environment, like a tunnel to the center of the earth, this I think is where the art of pacing comes in handy. Because, yeah, basically I'd want to go away and think about it and prep something, maybe choose a dungeon from my vast drive-through RPG library. And although obviously OSR and hex crawl play traditionally eschews putting too much of a thumb on the scales of how things are going to play out, I think pacing is still a thing that happens in GMing OSR. And so I would kind of probably, if it was right at the beginning of the session, I might have to just sort of be honest with the players and say, can we do something else and then come back to it? But if you're getting towards the end, you could start to slow this stuff down, play out some inter-character scenes where we're not exploring giant tunnels, or of course just come up with some weird stuff to encounter in the tunnel before you get to the bit you really, really need to prep for. That's what I would do. I would basically, TLDR, I would play for time.
I think that's right. I think it's what I would do too. I mean, I think it's okay to like have that conversation, right? Just say, hey, look, this sounds really exciting, but I wasn't ready for it. So maybe we do this for this session and then we come back to this for a next session. I would totally do that. That's not a big deal. There's a part of me though that wonders if how much of it also just depends on like how much your GM just has this archive, whether in their brain or like you said, your vast library of drive-through PDFs. Like, I wonder how much of this like just depends on the GM being that GM, you know, either a good improvisational GM or a GM who has access to lots of resources. You know, it's just a thing to ponder, I guess. Other question I had was, how much better would this book be if it was a little more boiled down to the best parts? I happen to think that there are frequent moments of brilliance in this book, and I actually, here I mean the hex crawl part. I actually think all the stuff around the hex crawl, like the tables and different things like that we covered in part 1, that stuff's all like very, very useful, I think. But the hex crawl part, a lot of it is really good. A lot of it's really dull. And I wonder, you know, if you look at like more contemporary or recent OSR products, like, for example, Operation Unfathomable, which we covered a little while ago, they are much more slim and focused, and like everything is really good, right? I wonder like how much better would be like an essential Carcosa.
Yeah, and it would certainly be a little bit easier to not skim when you're trying to read through it, because I think there is a reason that it's sort of, and when we say things are bland, I think what we're talking about is stuff like the settlements where it's full of 40 yellow men and they have a leader who's called this, and is that the kind of thing you're referring to?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, some of it's just, I mean, there's just some parts that are just distinctly better than others, right? Like, you know, there's a monster that's just like, that was rolled up on that table later in the book and it's roaming around. Okay. I mean, you know, like but then there's other parts that are like very, very interesting, like, you know, strange lakes filled with like, you know, weird objects and making noises. Like there's just a bit of it's real spiky, I think, in terms of like interestingness.
Yeah, and I think that's part of that is because you don't want it to, when you're actually playing the hex crawl, like for example, if you were just using the tables, if you only had the essentially good bits plus the tables that you were rolling on randomly, you would still want the blandness. You can't have it all interesting all the time because that doesn't work. It's like having music being loud all the time. You got to have the plateaus in between to go and recuperate. But what we got here is a worked example on a giant scale of what if I rolled up everything in advance? And what would happen is you would have quite a lot of hexes that are relatively predictable, I guess, right? Settlements and like a random monster. So I think you're right. I think in a way it would be better to, I don't know, what if you split out this whole pre-roll bit and made it into a kind of downloadable supplement to the book, and then the book itself was a slightly more manageable size, which had all the highlights in it, and the table that would recreate the bits in between. I don't know, I feel bad about saying it, because as I said, that's a lot of work to do 800 entries, but yeah, there's a part of me that thinks, yeah, you could do it.
It just makes me wonder because, Carcosa is an older book. So to some degree, like, I'm not knocking it. I mean, it's an older product and, things advance, things change. I look at something like the Ultraviolet Grasslands, which is a point crawl, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of moving through a territory, and everything is interesting, right? Like, it's all very interesting. And yeah, I just wonder if there's what would a Carcosa version of UVG look like, right? That's just something that I was wondering as I was reading through all 800 of these entries.
Yeah. I think I read them all, but I'll be honest, so many of them have now passed out of my head, I can never be sure.
Yeah, there was almost no point in reading them because I forgot 75% of them in the middle of doing it. Do you have any questions?
Oh yeah, I want to know, how did your hex crawl go? And specifically, was there anything that you expected Carcosa to be like, or the hex crawl to be like, but it didn't happen that way?
I would say that it pretty much conformed to my expectations. My expectations were that it was going to feel random, that it was going to feel almost, I don't know if meditative is the right word, but you think of movies like, have you ever seen that movie called Atarnajuat, Fast Runner? It's about Inuits.
No, I haven't. No, I've seen I remember the trailer, but I never saw the film.
Yeah, it's about Inuits, and it's 4 hours, 5 hours long, and it's got I don't know, a page of dialogue maybe in all 5 hours. It's just this very extended, wordless journey, right? Or you think of some of those sort of documentaries that have Philip Glass scores in the background, right? These very kind of just experiential, visual, sort of soaking it all in kind of feel to it.
Yeah, what was that Chris Marker one, Sous le Soleil or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah. But there's a number of them. In any case, my expectation was it was going to feel kind of like that, and it did. That was occasionally punctuated by fighting robots or fighting dinosaur things or whatever. But for the most part, it was just this kind of journey that, they had a destination kind of, and every hex, they didn't really know what they were going to get, what was going to happen. Sometimes I didn't, because I would read it right before we'd go into it.
I think that's the best way to do it. Yeah. It's fun for everyone.
Yeah. And it definitely conformed to how I thought it was going to go. The way I got it kicked off, I know we're going to talk about in the Expert Delve more in detail about this kind of thing, the sort of logistics or the mechanics of running a hex crawl. But I basically kind of started them literally in the most south and west hex on the map. And because that hex conveniently has this ancient creature in it, and this ancient creature kind of gave them some information, kind of some MacGuffin quest item type stuff, and they knew what hex that stuff was in, and so they just moved in a straight line toward it. That's how I got them kind of going. And as they just kind of sometimes they moved left or right on the hexes, but for the most part they kept a straight line, and they didn't reach the destination in the campaign that we did. But in the doing, they completed I think we did about 12 to 15 hexes, something like that, over the course of 4 sessions. And about 1.5 of those sessions was spent entirely in one hex. And so if we hadn't done that, I think we could have gotten 17, 18 hexes done pretty easy. So yeah, but it definitely conformed to my expectations of just feeling like a sort of journey that you experience, and a sort of disconnected quality, but the players seemed to enjoy it. They were all kind of they were all very caught up in the possibilities, right? As we were discussing it afterwards, they were very caught up in I wonder what this meant, or I wonder what that meant, or I wonder what would happen if we went over here, or I thought it was cool when this happened, but I wonder what it meant. It was very that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm into that kind of film, so that works for me.
Yeah. So, but it was good. Yeah, it was good.
Oh, and what system were you using out of interest?
I was using World of Dungeons, which was surprisingly hardy and capable.
Excellent.
And I did I don't know if I talked about this on Fear of the Black Dragon or not. I definitely did on one of our other shows. But I created essentially a little rules hack of Wodu to do a Carcosan native character generation. I can share that in the show notes, actually. Okay, so let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick us off.
Okay, one hex that caught my eye features an orange and old-fire-feathered Tyrannosaurus Rex, gasping out its life, displaying several wounds from an energy weapon. Underneath the dinosaur is a dead brown man with a tellurium beam rifle with 16 charges. Careless adventurers will get splashed with this mutant Tyrannosaurus's blood, which causes 1 die of damage.
I'm going to go with Hex 1716. When the stars are right, when the night is without a moon, when a dense and forbidding fog shrouds the lake, when dark-cowled cultists utter obscene chants and blasphemous incantations, when these things occur, a sunken island once more rises above the waves. The cultists disappear into the fog, gibbering wildly in their coracles and skiffs in a mad race to make landfall. The isle sinks again beneath the waters of the lake at dawn, and none who set upon it ever return.
In another hex, the number of which I also did not record, a horror-stricken man has already been half transformed into a fruit tree. He is rooted to the spot, and in 2 weeks the transformation will be complete. At that time, the chaotic blue 9th level sorcerer who conjured the arboreal thing that caused the man's transformation will arrive with his sensual purple lover. They plan to feast on the exotic dome fruit that the tree will bear. And I like this because it's a more or less direct rip from a scene that appears in A Voyage to Arcturus, which is one of the key inspirational texts for this book.
I didn't note the hex number, but I have used this particular encounter so many times in all my gaming, not just Carcosa. But there's a part where you can have this underground encounter with this small cult of people whose prophet is this bloated man whose body is covered in huge pus-filled sores. And these people slice open the pus-filled sores and drain the pus into these bowls that they drink and then receive visions.
Delightful. My final one is that I really like the illustration of the bone sorcerer and his fungi that he grows, which runs across the bottom of 2 pages in the dungeon description. It's a very nice black and white, sort of sketchy evocation of a cool-looking wizard who is, I think he's the undead. Anyway, he's got a kind of laser pistol thing, and it's really kind of just really captures the Carcosan spirit, I think.
Speaking of the Carcosan spirit, Hex 0403 really captures the sort of horrific melodrama that many of these Carcosan people's lives are filled with. It says, the smoke from a massive pyre can be seen for many miles. At night it casts a hellish glow across the landscape. A village of 222 Dulm men, led by an individual called the Sweet Fragrance, tend the fire and cast in offerings. These offerings can be spawn of Shub-Niggurath, cultists, sorcerers, and many others. Most are still alive when cast into the flames. Hunting parties arrive regularly with new victims. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, I am looking at the notes, and you have done a fabulous amount of research for this week's Expert Delve. It better be good. What are we talking about?
It's okay. I had help, which was good. We are talking about... Oh yeah, let me give you some backstory to this. There are a few guides around the place, one of which I'll mention later in Companion Adventures, which talk about how to do hex crawls as a GM. I've never really seen any player advice. That might be a niche in the market that can be explored by someone. But it's all usually about sort of setting up, how to track resources, all very useful things. But what occurred to me, and having seen some kind of videos and recordings of people stumbling a bit with this issue, is what's the actual conversation that you have? Like, would you literally say to people when you're doing a hex crawl? In Apocalypse World or Dungeon World, the mantra is always, what do you do, right? And so I was curious, what's the hex crawl specific version of that? So yeah, I did some research. I looked some things up because I have noticed that there's a very delicate moment of transition between being stopped, like at a camp or before you leave the town, and heading out to explore the map, essentially. And it's really, I've noticed in some of my games, it was a little bit of a cause, especially online, for things to grind to a halt and not to be sure if you could move forward. So I thought I would see what other people did. Specifically, I asked people to send me links to recordings of people actually playing, because I think people have a lot of theories about this stuff. But what they actually do, once they, you're not really thinking once you start talking as a GM. So whether you actually put your theories into practice is always a dubious matter. So the first thing I ended up watching, oddly enough, and not very OSR, was Adam Koebel. Don't know if you've heard of that guy. running.
The name is known to me, yes.
Yeah. And this was recommended by Johnston Metzger, he of The Nightmares Underneath and many other fine role-playing products. And he ran a game for ages on Roll20, which was live streamed. It's, a sort of one of those designed to be viewed games. And he was running the Tomb of Annihilation, aka the module I forgot to mention when we were talking about Tomb of Horrors in a previous episode of this podcast.
I know, I noted that too when we were done with it, yeah.
Anyway, so, and a large portion of that is a hex crawl through a jungle to go and discover various things. So here's what I noted that he did, which I thought was pretty good practice. One thing he did was to have an NPC who was a guide, and this was very valuable for a number of reasons, but not one that was actually telling the players, oh, you need to go this way or that. Because he made the point, actually sort of like, as an aside, that each hex is 10 miles on the map, and therefore exactly where you are is always a bit undetermined. And actually that's what the guide is doing. The guide tells you which way to go within a hex. You as the heroes are deciding, oh, we'll go south, or we'll go, I was going to say east or west, but actually a hex only has 6 sides, so if you can go south, you can only go southwest or southeast. But, the guide is just there to facilitate that general direction. Out of interest, did you have a guide for your Carcosa hex crawlers, or were they just by themselves?
What do you mean by guide? Like an NPC who
like an
knows
NPC.
The way?
Yeah, like a Sherpa,
No. We had like I said, we started with this 10,000-year-old being that traded information to them in exchange for them murdering it because it couldn't die. It wanted to be dead after 10,000 years.
Pretty Carcosa, yeah.
So he's very Carcosan as fuck, yeah. And so it gave them the basic thrust of where they needed to go. But I just straight up showed them the hexes, right? On the map.
Yeah. Yeah, Adam did that as well. But the function of the NPC, and also he made the map an in-world artifact as well. I don't think it had hexes that the player characters could see. And that was great because it meant there was no break between what the players were seeing and deciding things based on and what their characters were doing. So the guide would say things like, normally people would travel along the river, but you could walk it this way if you want. And he would ask questions in character of the PCs about what their plans were. And that avoids that weird hiccup where it suddenly becomes the GM saying, okay, what are we doing now? And that was pretty useful. One thing he did at the end of an episode was he would do a little wrap-up and also identify the kind of key landmarks that could be headed for next time, which I think was useful, gives you a bit of focus. We could go to the mountains, there's a city you could go to.
Oh yeah, that's pretty good. I could have used something like that, where at the end of the session, they're in hex, 04, 05 or whatever the fuck. And then I kind of say, oh, in the distance you see this, and then you see this, and you see this. Just keep that in mind. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's right. And then when he would pick things up in subsequent episodes, he would have, firstly, the guide character would say, so where are we going? Which is pretty useful.
I mean, the answer is to have the Gandalf NPC, it sounds like, right?
I think it is because it sounds like it's going to be a GNPC who tells you what to do, but in fact, she kind of steadfastly didn't really have an opinion about things, right? So that's how you need to play it. Can we go this way? Yeah, sure. I can make that happen. And then, and he would also describe, things that were still visible. So you wake up in the morning, you camp, you can see the light, you can see the city in the distance, and things in adjacent hexes. So that was, I think, useful for orienting. And he would just kind of quickly run through how much food does everyone have, any little prep bits. Then, and at the moment of setting out, he would leave a pause just after they talked about supplies and stuff. Just long enough for someone to jump in and go, oh, but I need to buy some caltrops or something. And then he literally said, let's set out. And that was a useful phrase that sort of transitions you into the, now we're going, we're making our navigation rolls, blah, blah, blah.
You said earlier in the little sort of introduction to this that the setting out moment is a delicate moment. Can you unpack that? What do you mean by saying that?
I think it's delicate because it's the moment where you're about to engage a different set of rules. I found when I was running Ultraviolet Grasslands that the best thing to do was to try and figure out what the consensus was at the table, so to speak. And then I would say, it sounds like you're going to head for this. And then again, I would leave time for someone to say, oh, no, we're not doing that, are we? Because there's always this moment where, or often what happens, if you jump the gun, then you sort of have to backtrack and go, oh, okay, no, you didn't go that way. And it all kind of, you lose momentum. That's the problem, right? It's not the problem that someone goes, oh no, actually we want to go left, not right. The problem is as soon as you go back to that point of talking about the decision, you've gone right back to the beginning of talking about the decision. You've lost all the things that happened before, and maybe people have to double check their supplies again, and someone wants to go and buy a spare mallet for the tent, or this kind of thing. So I really think it's that point where the game, the in-character part can really get broken if you're not careful, in a kind of way that's annoying for everyone as well.
That makes sense. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. All right, well, so continuing on with Adam's thing.
And that was pretty much what I got from his model. I didn't watch the entire series, mainly because it stops being about hex crawls after a few episodes, and also the episodes are really long. I don't know how people have time to watch like multiple AP videos.
I don't know how people do it. I like try to watch those sometimes, and I'm just like, fuck, like I don't have this kind of time in my day. It's crazy.
I know, man. So yeah, my key takeaways then from Adam's game then were in-character things like guides and maps, so that you're both looking at the certain diegetic elements, I guess we would say. And then, the let's set out, or I guess the plan is, and say something and wait for confirmation. And that's how you move into the, okay, now you have to roll your travel mechanics.
Cool. What else did you learn in your little excursion here?
Also, I think I should say that quite a few people sent me different things, and I value them all, but unfortunately it's a limited length podcast, so I'm only going to talk about one other thing, which was by Eric Vulgaris of this parish to some degree. He's sort of a friend of the Gauntlet, and he ran a hex crawl in Fever Swamp, although I should say it's more like a West Marches campaign, so it had a home base that people would set out from, but it was very hex crawly. And he wrote up, well, not only can you watch all his videos online, he did a 2-part post-mortem on his game, which is full of like really useful procedures, especially if you're running on Roll20 or something, like how to marshal all the little counters for your characters and copy the people who are playing this week into the right scene, and how to organize different bits, like kind of if somebody wants to open a blacksmith shop back in the village or this kind of stuff. Really useful. We won't get into that right now, but here's what happened. So he put mechanics out in the open. I think that's the very valuable thing here. In fact, earlier on today, I read something by Chris McDowell talking about how he shows the random encounter tables to the players. Once they've learned about the area from local people, then you'd know roughly how often this monster turns up and this one's really rare. So you can see the table. It's fine. And Eric kind of does that. He shows people what they can spend XP on to do. Yeah, so they know what their options are when they get back from the adventure. And that way you sort of, obviously you lose that sort of sense that, oh, well, I just have to think about what I'd like to do and we'll cover it with the rules. But equally, it shows you, much like moves do, the different basic moves in Monster Hearts compared to those in Apocalypse World. They tell you kind of what the game is about and what there's mechanical support for and what it's worth spending your time thinking about. As for the actual hex crawl, once you left that bit, he had a boat icon representing the party. And this is what I like, I think I would use it a lot for all expeditions, he would assign players roles or ask them to volunteer for them. So the captain has the final say over like what actually happens, like the caller back in the late 70s in D&D. And they would have the tie-breaking thing, vote on decisions. The cartographer who has to draw the map. The navigator who actually makes the navigation rolls for steering the boat. The storyteller who basically writes it up but gets XP bonuses. And these are player roles rather than character roles because it's using, I think, DCC, and therefore people have multiple characters and they can die easily.
I like that a lot. I think there's something very appealing about this idea of not just sticking strictly to a sort of rules as written approach to things. I don't know if this makes any sense, but what you've described there, what Eric is doing, this idea of like, okay, I need for there to be these different roles in the party, and I'm sure his text that he's using doesn't talk about that, and he just kind of came up with that on his own, right? I think that's really great. Or Chris McDowell letting players look at the tables because that's what makes sense, right? Like they would have a sense of it. So here, just look at the tables. I don't know, I just kind of like that approach to GMing. I think that's really appealing.
Yeah, I agree. And I especially think the different roles work particularly well on boats because there's that whole tradition of captains and navigators, and it's a natural fit.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, there's a thematic thing there too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing I liked from Eric's write-up is he talked about he's borrowed an innovation from video games, which I think is very sensible, which is fast travel. And for people who don't play video games, what that kind of means is that, like, let's say you're playing Assassin's Creed 2, which I don't unreservedly recommend, but you could. You can get around the place, like, let's say you're in Venice and you want to go to another city that's in that game. Verona, I don't think Verona's in it, but I'm going to say that. You can ride there, like you can do that on your horse and it takes ages, or you can do a little in-game thing where you pay some money to a stagecoach that's in the game and it just basically fades to black where you are, fades up, and you're already in the next city. And that's how you avoid having to, and especially on things with large actual maps, it means you don't have to endlessly ride back and forth across the same scenery. Actually, Red Dead Redemption is a better example because that's one where you really can ride around the whole map, or you can just skip it. So Eric did that where if you'd already explored a hex, you didn't need to actually do the travel through. You could just skip to the first unexplored hex on your route if you wanted to. And of course you could deliberately revisit one because you might want to do that. And I thought that was pretty smart.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what I just said too. Like this, it's a very like kind of free-form GMing in a way, right? It's like just kind of using your lived experience and using your instincts, right, to create like a better experience at the table. That's very impressive.
One little mechanical thing that it probably isn't really relevant to hex crawling in general, I just want to mention, is that the navigator role had a little treat, which was that if the navigation role failed, he would whisper, which in this case it's online, so it means a private message. But I think if you were doing face-to-face, it would be hilarious to actually whisper, is the result of their failure into their ear. And they can choose to take that or roll again and hope that they succeed or get a different failure result. And then, so then the procedure is, once the navigator's done the roll and like they've determined what the results of the travel overall are going to be, then he would start to describe all the sights and sounds and smells of the terrain they pass through. And of course, if you're doing fast travel, you maybe skip a bit, you just go swamp, swamp, swamp. And then there's this landmark or that landmark. And the closer you get to the destination, the denser your description of the surroundings becomes, which I think is something you would naturally do anyway, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's a valuable way of focusing the attention, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. It's really funny, this idea of fast travel. I'm really hung up on it for some reason. It's really interesting to me because if you think about Dungeon World and the Undertake a Perilous Journey move, Undertake a Perilous Journey is essentially just fast travel mechanized, right? Mm-hmm. Because we don't concern ourselves with the 8 days of the journey. We just do that roll to kind of see how it goes, right? I'm very into this. I'm very into this sort of like abstracting out things like that, right? That maybe aren't super interesting. So yeah, I don't know, just a bit of like interesting synergy there. Thought I'd point out.
Yeah. And I'd like to wrap up my kind of presentation of Eric's highlights with a little bit of emergent storytelling, this is, I think, quite common in OSR play and hex crawling in particular. I think all GM'd games have this as well, which is where players latch on to something you didn't expect, like the NPC that you invent off the top of your head, and and it becomes their favorite NPC, and they're like, oh, let's go talk to that guy again. And you're thinking, what's that guy's name? You must have had that, right?
Oh, it's a thing that happens, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I only did 4 sessions of a hex crawl, but it did happen. Like there were things that the players found to be very interesting that I didn't think they would necessarily. I thought that was an interesting phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, and Eric in his write-up of his session also notes the power of pattern matching. And I'll just quote him here. So he'd get a combination of events, weather, and details that would repeat, and players would think this was significant and kind of get scared as they began to associate certain creatures with certain phenomena. Like, for example, he gives white trees that tended to have either undead or leech things hanging around them. And the players jumped on this connection, even though it was random, it was just from the tables. And so they began to mark down these trees as significant details.
Right, yeah. That's pretty good. Yeah, that is very. It's a sort of different sort of emergent storytelling, isn't it? It's so interesting. Yeah, because coming from a sort of like story game background, emergent storytelling means something quite different, right? It's emergent in the sense of like we at a more sort of like at a more meta level as players are kind of suspending our disbelief and just kind of coming up with details and then jumping back into the fiction as if it was always supposed to be that way, right? Whereas like this is almost like, I don't know, it just feels different. It doesn't feel like it's the same thing. I'm having a hard time verbalizing the differences here, but
yeah, it is different. And then the other kind of emergent storytelling that I think is quite kind of a signature of story gaming things, and which I don't think is present as much in the hex crawl, is the character-based one. Like we bounce these different characters off each other, and we find out what happens. And as I was kind of consuming all these hex crawls, I did kind of see a pattern that while there were interesting stories, and of course, players will be self-driven to play their characters and so on, there wasn't much of that. And I was wondering, so this is my question for the Expert Delve, is there a way to get kind of characterization-based play and interesting things. Is there a way to build that into the cycle in a fairly unobtrusive way? Yeah.
So the emergent part, this is good. So the emergent storytelling you observed is a sort of like, it's the world's story that's emerging, right? And what you're saying here is, what can we do to make that more about the characters and more character intra-party dynamics and things like that? Oh, good. Our chance to be experts on the Expert Delve. So, yeah, I mean, well, so where should we start? I mean, it's a pretty big question. I feel like we've talked about this particular issue many times before on the show already.
Well, that's the thing, because let's start with the easy answer. It's at least once it's very easy to do the sitting around the campfire, and we've got our classic barrage of undertake a perilous journey questions like, what's the most annoying thing that the elf bard does, and so on. But of course, the difficulty with hex crawl is you've got a way higher density of travel scenes. Because, I mean, I could very easily do a dungeon world thing where it'll only come up once per session. You could do the same question every session. But if you're doing several, how do you... What other kinds of scenes and questions are there?
I got it. No, that's great. So I think what I would do, and indeed what I do, is I think you can always ask the players, how do you feel about that thing that just happened? Or if one of the player characters does something during a scene at the Hex that is questionable or particularly noteworthy for some reason, you can ask another player, how did you feel, player X, when player Y did that thing? And I do that a lot in all my gaming, not just like, my limited experience with hex crawls.
Yeah.
And what happens is it causes the player to really sit and think about how did they feel. And that tends to lead to conversation, both in and out of character. And so the way you develop intra-party dynamics is to constantly probe, to essentially be the little angel on their shoulder, or their conscience, or whatever part of their brain, like if they were real people, if these characters were real, whatever part of their brain would like have them thinking about their fellows, right? And and use questions to kind of draw that out of the players. And by doing that, you create space at the table to discuss it, either as players or in the fiction. And it kind of just rolls from there in a lot of ways,
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was just thinking, like, is there a way, or, to kind of incentivize that, mechanically for people who like that. And of course there's like the Night Witch's mission pool. The way you get that is by opening up to other characters. But on second thoughts, I don't think you need to incentivize it that much. I think you just ask the questions, and if it's an interesting question, then the players will want to answer it. And if it isn't, they'll just move on. They'll go, yeah, I'm fine with it. Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I'll tell you that, like, I, in the past, have been a big proponent of a mechanic called flags. And we've talked about it a million times on our other show, Discern Realities. But basically the idea with flags is it's these statements of how you want other characters to interact with your character. And in probably the last 4 World of Dungeons mini campaigns I've run, we haven't been doing the flags. I've just cut it entirely because I've discovered what you just said to some degree. And it could just be, and honestly, it could just be that, like, my players that I play with frequently are good at this now. Maybe they don't need the flags anymore, but to some degree, if you just pose the questions to players, or you just kind of put them in situations where they have to talk about thing X or thing Y, they kind of do it. The reward is just the fun scene. And that for my players at this point, that tends to be enough. Whereas with the flags, there was like an XP reward, but increasingly I feel like it's not even necessary.
Yeah, I think actually in Swords Without Master, of course that's about fighting things, but Evidai Ravishor does mention, he tells the overplayer to make the threats good, because the players are able to end action scenes at any time. So if they don't think it's an interesting scene, they'll just go, okay, and then we defeat it, right, and we go. And so I guess it's the same with these kind of personal questions, isn't it? Sort of, yeah, I deal with that personal question. Let's go and do the next hex.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty good. I mean one thing, I'll just tell listeners, if you're a listener who is stuck by Fear of a Black Dragon since the beginning, or you've been listening to us for a while, we've had this conversation a lot, right? We've had this conversation about like developing party dynamics, about exploring characters' inner thoughts, about characterization. Like we've done all that, and so I think there's a lot of like, to some degree, this conversation is very much like see previous episode, XXX. But I think I do think it's really interesting that what you observed watching these hex crawls is the emergent nature of what was happening was the world. I find that super fascinating. I really do. And I wonder if maybe there are lessons to be learned from that style of play to bring into story games, right?
There probably are, but I struggle to name them right now. But yeah, that's something to think about.
I think it's worth considering for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's not the goal of this show, but it's definitely something to think about. I mean, because I have to imagine that, something I find, I don't know. This is a criticism of story games and indie RPGs, and and it's a criticism I deliver with love, but it's definitely a criticism. I think that our little vector of the hobby, and here I mean story games, our vector of the hobby has such a strong reaction to the traditional GM player dynamic where the GM creates all of the world and the GM is responsible for all of that stuff and then just delivers it to the players. I feel like in story game play, the reaction against that is so strong, like in the other direction. It has kind of, in some sense, it's almost ended up like in the opposite place of we don't care about the world at all. Right? Like we only care about the characters, right? And I think that's wrong too. Am I right there? Am I wrong there? Like, am I just spouting off?
I think you're probably right. I think there is more room for surprise, or like story games are often a little bit comfortable. I don't mean that in terms of the subject matter. They're often quite harrowing, but they're often in a certain groove and you know what to expect all the time, broadly speaking. And taking on a little bit of this, the unpredictability of OSR play would give you the occasional, like, a dash of a different flavor, which would create a tastier meal overall.
Well, I just wish there were more systems that, like, more story games that actively encouraged, like, building the world outside of the characters' immediate concerns, right? I mean, that game Microscope, right, which is a sort of like history building game, it is it is frequently lauded for what it does, right? You build the history of this world, and it's a story game, and it's very frequently lauded for what it does. I don't actually like it very much, but I think the reason why it has so much like people love it so much is because it's a story game that does this thing, like this like world building thing, which I feel like that part of the hobby has kind of gotten away from. Anyway, we're really just kind of like diverged at this point.
Yeah, we're just throwing out open calls for designers to solve the world's game problems at this point. Yeah, for sure. So get on that.
Absolutely. Yeah? Well, this has been very interesting. I mean, kind of a loose, kind of free roaming topic. I mean, I think that what you did watching other people who are more who have a lot of expertise with hex crawls, I think that's very, very interesting. I myself didn't get to do a lot of that research in preparation for this, except, of course, running a hex crawl. And my opinion of it is that it is a very different and interesting style of gaming. I'm not convinced it's for me. I think I'd favor the more point crawl type of thing that we've been talking about in other episodes with other games.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that? Like, where do you come down on hex crawl versus point crawl?
Well, it's funny you say that. Yeah, I was about to jump in there and say I think I prefer point crawls, but then again, with this new technology of the Eric Vulgaris patented fast travel
and all that stuff, yeah, I know it's looking better. Yeah.
That kind of is a point crawl, isn't it? So. Yeah, maybe this is my way back. Mostly when I do hex crawls, I've done a few. I like to have the little, what they call mini hex crawls, which are actually pretty big. So things like, what's it called? Tornado Island was one that was released for free on the internet recently. That was quite good. It's got tornadoes in it. And that was, because it's nicely contained, it basically has a lot of the characteristics of a point crawl because you don't have to read 800 entries to know everything that's on the map. So I don't know. Yeah, I think maybe that fast travel bit of these techniques, that's the way to hit the perfect balance between freedom of movement and just keeping the highlights, making the whole thing a highlights reel.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and go to companion adventures. Codex Storm, the newest issue of the Gauntlets RPG zine, is now available in our Patreon feed. Codex Storm is all about fantasy. Here's what you'll find inside. To the Halls of the Stormlord, an epic adventure for macchiato monsters inspired by Norse myth. The Rubble of Kiraminar's Sanctum, a collection of elements for Dungeon World. The Subgothy of Storms, or Lightning in a Bottle, a journey scenario for 5e and other fantasy games. A Murder in Port Tam, which is a wild chase scenario for the Black Hack. Our newest miscellany, 3 dozen unnatural weather phenomena, 5 pieces of beautiful art, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Storm, just make a $4 or higher pledge to the Gauntlet Patreon in August. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Let's start with films. Kick us off, Tom.
Okay, from 2017, the sci-fi space romance kind of thing, Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, which is a visually sumptuous feast, plot-wise not so much, directed by Luc Besson, based on a series of French comics. And especially the opening sequence here on the planet Mool, before it gets destroyed. Spoiler alert for the second minute of a film. This really looks like Carcosa to me. It's kind of slightly odd, purpley pink color palettes and odd aliens. And it actually, for the rest of the film, you do see quite a few little weird devices or, goopy aliens and strange looking people that I think are quite Carcosan as well. But it's surrounded by a lot of harder sci-fi textures and spaceships and stuff. So if nothing else, watch that first opening sequence. And I think that's pretty Carcosan. And the rest of it, if you're still in for the ride, keep your eyes open for the various space alien technology items that you could also be inspired by.
Mine is, my first recommendation is kind of related. I think that for all of its heft, the Carcosa book actually doesn't do much to describe the landscape or the terrain of Carcosa, right? You're kind of just meant to fill all that in on your own, and that's part of the pleasure of it, to be fair. But I do think that, like, if you want some resources for like what this world might look like, I got a few things for you here. Straight up Google the phrase 1970s science fiction art. I think 1970s science fiction art is particularly appropriate for Carcosa because there's such an emphasis on color in that artwork, and I think Carcosa is a setting that wants color. I think that the film Jodorowsky's Dune and associated concept art searches is another great thing in that same vein. And also, there's a video game that came out a few years ago called No Man's Sky, a sort of procedurally generated planet-hopping video game. I played it for a little while, and honestly, it's super boring. Like, don't buy it. It's very dull. I've never been more bored in my life playing a video game, but it's very beautiful visually, and you can just Google No Man's Sky concept art to get more strange, colorful alien landscapes.
Cool. Well, I'd like to recommend an RPG book, which is, as previously mentioned, hex crawl guides are available. And aside from the crucial question of how to fast travel and what do you say before entering a hex, How to Hex Crawl by Joe Johnston is widely lauded as the kind of go-to tome. And I would agree with that. It's really comprehensive. And if you're thinking about GMing a hex crawl, you should go and read that. It's available on RPG Now and assorted other outlets, I assume, as well.
I have a couple of G+ resources for you listeners. The first is on G+. If you go to the community section of G+, there is a community called Carcosa, and it is focused on the Lamentations of the Flame Princess Carcosa that we've been discussing here. And it's very interesting. It's essentially just a community where people find cool bits of inspiration for different, different moments in the book, or, different strange artworks or custom little procedures or rules hacks or items. It's just a community where people kind of post all that stuff. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I recommend kind of just consuming and observing that community. A few of my less favorite interactions with people on G+ have been in that community. But as far as like just a resource, it's pretty terrific. The other G+ resource that I actually think is in some ways better, even though it's totally different in scope, it's a G+ community that is kind of semi-private, I guess. I mean, it's totally public and that you can just go look it up and go in there, but it was not really designed to be like public. And that is a community called Masters of Carcosa. And what this is put together by Ramanan S., who is a friend of the show. And essentially, he was running a long-term Carcosa campaign, and he used this G+ community almost as a wiki for keeping track of things that happened in the sessions, maps and pictures and things. He would create all kinds of like little tables and resources and other things like that he would kind of post there. And it's really, really interesting. I've spent a bunch of time there lately going back into it. It stretches back to like 2014 is when the campaign kicked off. And it's more or less defunct at this point, but it's really fascinating because you go back to the beginning and you can kind of, down to the level of like the G+ invitation that he sent out to the players and all the resources that were there. You can see like all the different moving parts of Ramanand's campaign. And I found it really fascinating, because it's almost like a historical archive or something. You can go back and see the drawings that the players did of their characters or the maps that they were drawing to kind of keep track of things. And just an interesting wealth of of information about how, what a Carcosa campaign might look like. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that does sound good. I'll have to check that out. I would like to wrap up my bit just by saying you can find the research sources that we mentioned earlier. So Eric Vulgaris has a blog, search for his name. You'll find his write-up of his Fever Swamp hex crawl there. And also Adam Koebel's Tomb of Annihilation videos are all on YouTube. I assume like on Twitch or something as well. But anyway, to go on YouTube and you can find I would say just scan through. If you're just interested in the hex crawl bit, just scan through the preview until you see hexes and then click there and start playing. There's also dungeon crawling and loads of stuff. It's a massive sprawling campaign. So yeah, but good stuff though. Very watchable.
Well, listeners, that's our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we are a production of The Gauntlet. Just go to The Gauntlet's Twitter @GauntletRPG and tweet at us there. We have a community on G+ called The Gauntlet. Just search for it. You'll find it. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com, where we have launched a brand new blog, a daily blog with all kinds of cool stuff in it. So go check that out. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Jason, thank you.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.